Quite excited about this one. The big A word, AI, right? It's on the tip of everybody's tongue. And yes, Elena Doms, she's already on stage. Please welcome her, and she'll introduce her panelists. And the name of the panel is AI and the Energy Transition, Opportunity, Risk, and System Impact. Welcome, and take it away. Can we give them a warm hand of applause?
The same technology is one of the most powerful tools for climate and nature transition, and also one of the fast-growing pressures on it. That tension is not new. Every generation has exponential technologies. For example, in the 1900s, that was the mainstream adoption of cars. They help us get to places faster, but increase our reliance on gasoline. In 1950s, it was nuclear energy. It's carbon-free, but it needs to be managed effectively to not be dangerous. Now it's AI. In 2025, AI electricity demand grew 6 times faster than the global economy, and it's at the lowest it will ever be. At the same time, AI technologies are used to predict climate disasters, to help us fight deforestation, to manage things smarter than we've ever did before. So the story isn't simple. It's not AI versus the planet. It's a much more interesting question on how we direct one of the most powerful tools in history to where it is needed most. And that is the question we are going to explore today. I'm not a neutral moderator. I'm leading European expansion for oxygen conservation, which is the largest natural capital asset manager in the UK. We own and restore 50,000 acres of land, scaling conservation like never before. And we also built our own AI platform to screen land and to manage natural capital assets over 100 plus data layers in seconds, helping us take investment decisions much faster. Ironically, we called it Claudio after the supermodel, and it predated Claude. Today, we have amazing panelists ready to dive into the topic of AI and the opportunities and risks that it brings. Unfortunately, we've lost one over the way. Josh from Nvidia couldn't join us. It's probably the effect of the heat wave, and he's not feeling well. He'd love to have been here. However, it makes the topic and the action even more urgent. So let me introduce our wonderful panelists. Elena Koycheva is a sustainable investing specialist at Northern Trust Asset Management. She partners with clients in supporting them to meet their sustainable investing objectives and works with partners across her firm to develop innovative sustainable investing solutions. Charlie Hodgson from Egis, he's the CEO for Europe and Africa, and he's building huge infrastructure projects, and he's applying AI to do it smarter and better. And John Walker-Robertson is Global Head of Connected Markets and Sustainable Finance at the London Stock Exchange Group. He's working on how data and AI can help capital find the right sustainable places to go. John, thank you for hosting us. The airco is a game changer. Maybe we can all camp here for the night, if you don't mind. Well, every person on this panel, as you can see, is working at the intersection of AI in nature and climate, but from a very different angle. So my first question is, where are you seeing AI create the most genuine, unexpected value in the transition right now? Something that is not in the headlines. Elena, let's start with you.
Well, I think probably, maybe it is probably in the headlines, but I would say it's really something that, in my view, it's the resource efficiency. I think that this is probably the underlying message, right, that we're seeing. I think this is probably one of the forefronts in the headline from my perspective, that I think it's so important applying this level of technology to use our resources very efficiently, to actually be smart with them, but then also to see how this translates as value for our investors and ultimately, right, to the beneficiaries that our clients serve as well for the long term.
Charlie, you come from construction, which uses a lot of resources.
It does. It's probably, construction and built environment is probably the biggest consumer of carbon resources in the global economy, about 37, 38%. of carbon emissions come from my industry. What we're seeing, it's still early days for implementation in construction, to be frank. The industry traditionally is a bit conservative and slower at innovating than some other sectors, perhaps. But what we're seeing is on the logistics and planning side, huge improvements in the making sure the whole of the supply chain is ready on time, and making sure that the materials can be in the right place at the right time, and that the level of waste and in the system can therefore be reduced and save costs, save time, save carbon, which is good for everybody.
The waste in construction is also a huge topic, right?
Absolutely.
I was doing a calculation at some point, and apparently every year we throw away 2 full New Yorks of buildings.
Yeah,
which is just enormous.
It's crazy. On a standard small-scale construction site, about 30% of the materials end up going to waste, which is terrible. On a larger sort of civil infrastructure site, it's much smaller than that, but still very, very significant. So, anything we can do to reduce that waste saves money, saves time, saves carbon, which is good for everybody.
Well, let's put AI to work there.
Yeah, absolutely.
John, you're working on the other side in terms of data and using an AI. What are the most genuine and expected gains that you're seeing?
Well, just going back to the point you made about being able to get here in the temperatures we're experiencing in London. On my way out this morning, I saw a report that a panel on extreme heat got cancelled because of the extreme heat. So it's an important topic, right? I think, look, when it comes to AI, we really look at it from the perspective of like, what's the data we can start to gather and use and analyse and think forward with now. So, for us, it's about how do we understand it from a risk perspective? How do we start to price it? Especially when it comes to physical risk, nature and biodiversity. As a Londoner, if it's really, really hot or it's predicted to be a heat wave, I know the trains aren't going to run on time. If it's really, really wet, I know the trains aren't going to run on time. That's that's the nature of being a Londoner. But it's interesting, right? Because that's not something that we've been able to model forward, right? That's just user knowledge. That's just experiential. We can actually start to use that data now and use it to kind of price assets, understand where capital flow should go, and also know whether or not we should probably be working from home.
And it's interesting, right? Because normally we used to predict something based on the historical data, but in the world where everything is changing so fast, we can't just rely on historical data. Last week, I was in Rome, and there was the Caribbean Development Bank, and they said the natural catastrophes are so much bigger now, and they had to move children's schools away from the coast because of the rising sea levels. But they also said how more difficult it is to predict these catastrophes just because we are not expecting to see them anymore, right? John, I want to dive deeper. So the London Stock Exchange sits at the center of how capital is priced and directed. So how is AI changing what investors can see about where institutional capital should go, and what the human analyst would miss?
So I think it comes down to that point about, again, risk is probably the easiest example, and I think you just described a good one. I think the usual, when we think about the usual analyst, what do we have before? We had a lot of backward-looking data, right? So thinking about an investor which has got a lot of sort of physical assets in their book, how did they think about how they priced the risk in the past? They might have had static data about floodplains, self-reported reports, a certain amount of understanding perhaps about supply chain. I think when you look at what we can do with not just supplementing it with data, but being able to bring that data from just an instrument into insight, then we can start to think about, well, how does my book look over the next sort of 5 to 10 years with that priced in? What does that do to my cost of capital? What can I do to say perhaps influence those organisations where I think they've got risk and how they can diversify or mitigate that risk? If you've got a hold over an investment over 10 to 15 years, these are really critical items. And to your point, if we're just looking backward, we might just be using models which are like, what was the previous prevalence without having an understanding for the fact that they're going to increase as we go forward. And that's what we really need to model. And a lot of that is about bringing multiple data sets together. Now, for, I think, large institutions and, highly liquid markets, that has been being done. But when we think about medium size and long tail, that's really, really difficult. There's a huge data sets that we either haven't had or been able to put together. And that's where I think there's real value. These are big probabilistic models that we're looking at using with LLMs, but, there's a serious amount of deterministic risk-taking decisions which can be used to unlock value in those data sets.
How interesting. Can you give a concrete example where data like that and prediction changed the allocation capital decision?
I mean, I think, like I say, that, you know, investor, if you're a bank and you're looking at a loan book, you're looking to, you know, sort of understand, again, risk within that loan book. If you're an investor looking at allocating capital in equities, you can understand how, you know, if you think about, mortgage, a mortgage book in LA, right, and the wildfires that are going on there, is that a single one-off catastrophic event? What does that do to, your loan book? What does it do to, those mortgages? What does it do to insurance companies? A conversation I was having recently with one of the major insurers was talking about the investment going on there to the tune of like £4 billion in AI, because insurance is a data game. The more you know, the easier it is to price your policy, and the better return you have on that policy, right? So they're driving capital into AI to get insight, to be able to, improve their models. So we see it all over. We also see it with respect to where governments and agencies are looking to offer incentives and discounts to suppliers that they use, because they're maybe looking at their management structures and whether they're looking at or pricing in any risk within their portfolios and their kind of capabilities. I think we see it all over it. Yeah.
Wonderful to see such a widespread adoption. Elena, you are working directly with investors too, who are actually allocating capital. Where is the opportunity in all of this, and specifically for nature and climate? Because this is not the topic that is on top of the agenda in all of the investment rooms yet.
Well, probably I have to say, right, I think that still with the large institutional investors that we work with, right, I would say the majority actually do think, right, about kind of climate, nature, and system level risks as well, right? So actually it is one of the big questions, right, that we aim to address with investors as well. And I think, right, maybe to give you a little bit of background, right, so Northern Trust Asset Management is a 1.4 trillion asset manager. We have around 200 billion in sustainable investing solutions for our clients. And this is where, when we think about the application of AI, we think about it from the two perspectives. So what are the benefits? How does it actually support, right, so the climate transition, nature, the application in the business life, but then also what are some of the risks, right, and threats and challenges that we actually really need to be conscious when we steward our clients' assets. So if I take it from the opportunities perspective, this is where we see AI application really for the benefit of climate change. For example, if I think of some of the strategies that we're employing and how we're thinking about that, is really we're thinking about, for example, the optimization of grids. What does that mean? We know, and we were hearing it from some of the last panels as well, the overall grid system is something, right, that we know is a challenge in the context of the demand of energy that is happening from data centers that are built for AI purposes. So this is where we see AI gaining actually an application, so optimizing the framework that is being applied. And so this is, for example, one of these concepts that we're aiming to build on when we think about some of our signals within our quantitative investing strategies. And this is where we're applied in our green innovation signal, for example. Similarly, I think probably, and I would touch on some of the themes, I think in the last panel, we were talking about the energy transition. I think what we're also recognizing with this particular development, the demand for energy, we're actually seeing the demand for greener energy, but then also opportunities to think about what are, for example, some of the data hyperscalers investing in alternative areas. I think geothermal has been one of the areas where we're seeing this type of development and investment, so really broadening the opportunities for green energy. At the same time, I think probably very dear to me personally, as I have been also looking into some of the hard-to-abate sectors, right, and cement as well. But I think what we have been seeing, particularly from the cement transition pathway that has been established, is the reliance on carbon capture and utilization technology. And I think I'm actually really pleased to hear, even from the last panel, that this is also yet another opportunity. So I'm seeing it more as this system level perspective, where these technologies that are really needed from these hard to abate sectors to allow them to decarbonize are actually now finding the utilization, right, the demand from the energy perspective to actually connect of the actors together to allow for this system to be built. I think I will also touch on nature as well. When we think about nature, we're seeing actually a lot of application for AI technologies. Particularly, I would think of an example in terms of farming. We're seeing a lot of technologies being developed in the farming sector to allow technological advancements to optimize, for example, fertilizer utilization, allowing farmers to manage their farmlands also digitally, right, through the use of AI technologies and applications to be able to also potentially reduce, right, the impacts of climate change, know when is the right time to be resource efficient in that application, but then also to think about what are maybe some of the other broader elements that they're having exposure to, such as the social elements, potentially, right, so reliance on workforce that might not be immediately available for them to use. I think, right, having spoken about the opportunities, I'll also, of course, mention some of the kind of the considerations that we're having. Of course, AI is an emerging new technology. We're actually really thinking about how companies are having their governance around the implementation of AI. We want to be very mindful about that. So this is where our stewardship team has also released a paper on AI. And this is where we're not only sharing how we think about stewarding our clients' assets, but then also we have used this opportunity to guide the companies in which we invest, to guide them to see what, in our view, is really the strategic perspective on governance. What are the guardrails that we're expecting to see in the governance from a strategic perspective? And lastly, I will also touch on the social elements. We have also seen, right, this social tension that has been created due to the increased build of these data centers. So this is where we continue to follow this particular perspective on social pressures. What is the local impact, right? Of course, centers being built on potential land that can be used for farmland purposes, or also the impact on water as well. So really thinking about both the opportunities and the risks when we invest on behalf of our clients.
Data centers, hard to abate sectors. Perfect segue, Charlie. That's what you're doing in the construction. How do you use AI to optimize it?
Yeah, we've got several live projects where we're using AI to drive improvements. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The first is in use of visualization technologies at the master planning stage for projects. So when you're considering options and consulting with the public, getting your planning permissions and your consents in place. The architecture companies within our business focus on those areas. So WWP and the 10N Collective have been using AI tools to help the developers see and feel what their asset might look like. Currently mostly being used in the residential space, but we're also working with National Grid on their connections program and potentially onto their Great Grid upgrade as that rolls into delivery. And I can see real clear applications for this technology to help them get through the really complicated stakeholder consenting and approvals process to demonstrate to the public the options that the different investments will have in transmission equipment, in the transformers and everything else we need to do to raise the capacity of the grid to meet the transition we're all heading through. The second one is a really interesting application of again, visual technology, but this is taking road traffic data on the A2 motorway in Poland, where we're the operator of that PFI asset, and we've found a way of consolidating that data and information on traffic flows to use it to much more quickly detect disruption, normally broken down vehicles or stopped vehicles. And that's enabled the emergency response teams to get there much quicker in a matter of a few minutes rather than an hour, keep the road flowing, protect anybody who's stranded, and improve the operational KPIs of the asset through doing that. And then the last one I'll talk about, which is a bit more nascent, but I think has a huge opportunity for the whole of the construction sector, is the work we're doing for construction supervision for the Grand Paris Express, which is the largest metro investment in Europe at the moment. We are working with the public sector funding client to manage the construction contractors that are delivering that upgrade. And we have a job to do to make sure we coordinate all of the work that the contractors undertake. And on a weekly basis, we have to validate the work schedule for the next week. And if you think about, say, a very complex, multi-level subterranean station that's going through its construction, maybe the civil works is finished, the building's built, and now you need to put the plumbing, the electrics, the fire safety standards, the telecommunications, the vertical transportation into that asset, and doing that in a really coordinated way and managing all the clashes in resource availability, access, is really, really important and can fundamentally reduce the risk of two teams turning up on site and trying to be in the same space at the same time, or two sets of subcontractors turning up and their actual physical assets not fitting. And we're seeing real success in deconflicting those programs and enabling the work to be built more quickly and with less tension in the supply chain, and therefore hopefully less wastage as well.
Well, these are perfect examples of how AI supports the construction sector. I'm gonna turn it a little bit around. Are there efficiency benefits from AI? Are they outweighing the AI demand? Because the future of AI is still uncertain. Demand is climbing up really fast.
Sure.
Can really AI revolutionize construction in terms of carbon in materials and energy usage? And what's your take on these trade-offs?
Yeah, no, look, it's a very tricky question because right now we're kind of at the foothills of implementation. But we can see the electricity usage from AI, and we can there's been other panels that have focused on how we can best implement AI to minimise the impact. But I sit on the benefits side and how we can use those tools to realise savings. As I said in the introductory piece, the construction industry is 37% of the global carbon emissions. And we are incredibly wasteful. We take longer than we should quite often to get things built. And I can see many ways in which AI can be potentially implemented to drive that change, that improvement, the reduced wastage in like high carbon intensity materials like cements and steel, but also to drastically reduce the level of energy requirement in asset operation. Whether that's the electricity to run a train network in a station, or to heat a home, or to run a hospital. Smart buildings and the technology that you can get where the data can start to be monitored and almost freely analysed to tell you how and when you need to operate those systems more efficiently, I think generates huge benefits. And if AI is currently generating, say, 1% of carbon emissions, if the construction industry can just be 5 or 10% more efficient, we alone will be able to offset the costs of or the disbenefit of AI, and that's without all the other use cases that sit in all the other sectors of the economy. So I would put myself in the kind of cautiously optimistic bucket. What we need to do as an industry is to work much more collaboratively as to how these tools are going to be used to optimise the interfaces we have through sort of outline planning, procurement, construction, commissioning and operations of the built environment to enable it to release those benefits for everybody. And as we were saying outside, sometimes the challenges, the benefits are very diffuse, and we need to make sure there's a good way of monetising them, either through through tokenisation or charging regimes to drive the decision makers in the developers and the government funders to make the right decisions at the capital allocation stage to make sure that the operations are as efficient as possible.
I want to dive more into that tension, right? So currently AI is 0.5% of global CO2 emissions. It is predicted to become anywhere between 1% and 4% of global emissions by 2030, which is in 4 years. There is an opposite statistic that AI can also help us cut global emissions by 4% if it's utilized effectively across different sectors. But behind that and all the AI infrastructure, there's also land use and water use and resources use to get it running. So how likely is this scenario where the demand of AI is actually faster and using more resources than the good that it creates? And since you've mentioned, Charlie, about the capital allocation, John, a question over to you. When you look at the data and the investment decisions, which gap do we need to close right now so that it goes in the right direction? Where do you see the biggest opportunity?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think what we've got to understand is that we're at the thin end of the wedge when it comes to AI usage, right? So the statistic you use, I'm sure, will probably double by next year, and who knows where it ends up in 5 to 10 years, right? So we're going to be using AI exponentially more in the future. There are points about efficiency and how both cost and energy usage will go down over the course of time and all those sorts of things. But ultimately, we know that we're going to be using it as a tool for the future. What I thought was interesting that you were just saying there's this perennial sort of tension around does AI bring efficiency or productivity? In a lot of rooms that I'm in where we talk about AI, we talk about productivity as being like the winning game. If what you're trying to do is just look for cheaper ways to do things with the same level of output, you're effectively going to lose in the long term. So what does that mean when I think it comes to productivity? It doesn't mean that we forget about efficiency. We think about how we can reallocate capital within organizations to eliminating like transaction costs, right? And actually that means that, and to your point about the diffuse arguments, it's about aligning things which previously we weren't able to do and increasing productivity as a consequence. And I think that is only going to proliferate around organizations. And I think that what we don't see is the enormous amount of waste that goes on today, which we kind of label as transaction costs or other, which they themselves have a tax on energy and carbon and all those sorts of things. We were discussing outside a project that I was working on looking at development funding. One of the interesting areas around development funding, which has been on a huge decline over the last 12 months, was the hundreds of millions of observed waste in transaction cost, right? But imagine if you had that capital reinvest. And that's the sort of aim of being able to use a tool which allows you to gain greater insight, is that you start to remove that and then you can bring that capital back into your investment. I think that's really important to think about, because that coordinative capability in terms of understanding the holistic benefit of having a more unified, a sort of infrastructure building. We were talking about the grid and, diffuse views on like where and how it's done, by whom, and the political parts to it. We can start to look at the big picture, zoom out, and we can be more efficient about how we deliver. So capital will start to move around because there'll be more capital freed up. I'm sure we're all going to be spending a lot of money on tokens as well. We shouldn't get away from that. But I think, capital can't price what it can't see. And the more data we have, the more coordinated we are, the better we can understand, what was effectively used for free, which is, like nature in the land, and then also understand what we can put in and understand from a risk perspective as well. And that's going to direct capital flows. So I think, it's going to be a dynamic landscape. We're going to be using AI more, and the energy consumption used by that is going to go up exponentially. But equally, I expect to see it come down as we are less wasteful and able to eliminate those other costs, which we otherwise are seeing no benefit from already.
This is a question that we reflect on so much in terms of like how to use it for good and balance it off. And we're often thinking, the tokens usage is only going to go up. I think now it's already around 10 billion globally, and it's the lowest it will ever be. How can we make sure we use it in the right way, but also maybe how can we make sure that they're net positive from the beginning? Maybe regeneration is baked into them. Maybe behind, they're also directing money flows into nature and climate at the same time, so that it's not so resource draining.
But I think that's up to us, right? It's a governance question, right? AI doesn't decide where it goes on its own. It's about how we decide to allocate that, capability and capital and knowledge, right? So there is a governance element there, and there's also there's a dynamic environment about where we get ROI as well. But like, it's about where we point it and how we make it efficient in that respect.
True. I have closing question for all of you. 15 seconds to answer, so that's going to be an interesting challenge. If there is one thing you can advise to people here in this room, very practically, what they should be paying more attention to, or what they should do right away when they leave today, what would that thing be? Elena, let's start with you.
Wow, well, I think it would be thinking about what is the application of AI for opportunities, right? I think, yes, and coming from a sustainable investing background, right, we think about the risks, but I think that I'll challenge you, right, to think about all about the opportunities. How are you translating that in your own lives, right? How is that being applied for the climate transition, for nature, but then also in your in the investment opportunities that you're seeing?
Thank you. Charlie?
Great, thanks. I would say for me, we're all rushing to implement AI as fast as possible. I think we need to stop occasionally and think about some of the impacts that might have on the workforce and the workforce of the future. We're a big employer of graduates and training apprentices, and I've had managers in my organisation tell me, oh, actually, we're going to take a gap year this year and not employ any graduates because we're going to get AI to do all the work that they had been doing. And I've said, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to keep investing in our human capital as well at the same time and make sure that we train the future managers and leaders of our organisation, because otherwise there's going to be nobody there to make the decisions.
Wonderful, thank you. John?
Yeah, I'd love to build on that point, actually. I think, we were talking outside, and one of the things I think about the use of AI is around the democratization of insight, right? But, AI being probabilistic, not deterministic, it's great. We had a lot of data before, but it was really hard to harness and use to actually, generate decision-making. But ultimately, the point there is about outcomes and decision-making. And we need people who are decision-makers because they have the experience, the understanding, they know what works and what doesn't work in the real world. They are party to conversations which isn't in the data set. And if we remove that layer that's coming up, beneath us to be able to make those decisions, we're going to be in a really difficult place in a few years, because right now we're able to leverage those tools because we've had that experience. So we've got to find a way to ensure that, early careers professionals have that same participation in the decision-making and experiential process.
Thank you. I'm loving that we actually finished with the people and remaining human. And it was not an easy conversation today. It's a conversation of direction. Of course, we can't solve it in one day, but we have to make sure that AI becomes a powerful tool in the transition that we need. I'm incredibly optimistic for the reason that AI doesn't live in an actual cloud in the sky. It lives in the ground. And the more we scale it, the more we'll realize how dependent it is on nature and stable climate, and the more we'll have to invest in regenerating it. But one thought that I want you all to have as you leave this room is, how are you using AI as a force for good in what you're doing today? Thank you.
Very much.